Welcome to this session from HS2 to virtual reality, the new industrial revolution. My name is Rob Killick. I'm going to be the chair of this session, and we have a really excellent panel of speakers. The big question is, has the United Kingdom given up on being an industrial leader? And if so, is that a problem? I think really, most of the debate hinges around that central question. So our speakers, in the order in which they will be doing their introduction. Opening is Christian May, on my left here. He's the editor of City AM, London's daily business newspaper, with a readership of just under 400,000 professionals. Prior to this appointment, he was head of communications and campaigns at the Institute of Directors, the UK's largest organisation for business leaders. Second will be Jeremy Dalton, who is on my second left. Jeremy is an evangelist of all things technology. He is invested both mentally and financially in virtual reality and has given multiple talks on various aspects of VR. Jeremy works in PwC's Digital and Emerging Technologies team. Our third speaker will be Hayaatun Silem, on the far left. Dr. Hayaatun Silem is Director of Programs and Fellowship at the Royal Academy of Engineering. She is also the Executive Lead for the Academy's Enterprise Hub. Fourth is Dr. Paul Reeves, who is on my right. Paul Reeves is a designer of engineering software, having worked both commercially and as an academic researcher. Last but not least, on my far right, Dr. Jack Stilgoe, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Science and Technology Studios at University College London. He has spent his professional life in the overlap between science policy research and science policy practice at the think tank Demos, the Royal Society, and at UCL. I would also like to thank our session partners, the Royal Academy of Engineering and City AM, without whom this event would not have been possible. Christian.
Well, thank you very much. I wondered how I got on this panel. I just reminded that City AM is a sponsor, so that would explain everything. If the chat that we were having on the walk over is anything to go by, we're going to cover quite an extraordinary range of topics, everything from 3D printing to robot sex. And I don't mean robots having sex with each other. I mean, well, who knows what I mean. As an editor, my job is to hold strong opinions on topics that I don't fully understand. What I thought I would just do to kick off is look at some of the issues that we see perhaps from an editorial perspective at a business and finance newspaper, which largely involves following the money, one of the oldest rules in journalism, and to get a sense of where we are in terms of what the next industrial revolution might be, or indeed whether it will be an industrial one at all. But on that point, I think something to kick things off with is just an observation that the state of manufacturing, and indeed even traditional manufacturing in this country, is in much better shape than popular discourse would have us believe. It employs as an industry about 2.5 million people. Britain finds itself as the 11th largest manufacturing nation in the world, and indeed in certain sectors, including aeronautical engineering, we really are world leaders. And I think that a lot of the debate and complaints that you often hear about how Britain is a country which doesn't make anything anymore is a slightly strange blend of nostalgia and ignorance, because actually I think we have an exceptionally powerful story to tell about some of the industries and skills in this country. I think when it comes to larger scale infrastructure projects, a lot of the obstacles that they encounter tend to be political, and they themselves tend to have emerged from a situation whereby the government's commitment to localism and devolution can often come up against its own desire to see certain scale projects rammed through. That's going to be true of issues ranging from HS2, as we've got mentioned in the title, through to airport capacity, for example. So there are political obstacles to some of the larger engineering and infrastructure projects in the country. The incredibly exciting rate of growth in the technology sector, and I don't just mean financial technology, but the digital economy and technology sector is probably where I would feel most comfortable talking about a second revolution taking place. The scale of investment in the technology sector in the UK at the moment is extraordinary. Simply just the amount raised from venture capital funds into technology firms in the UK in the first 9 months of this year was about £2 billion of venture capital funding. That is more than 2014 put together. It is more than all VC-raised tech funding since 2010, just in the first 9 months of this year. 75% of the money raised in that field have been allocated to firms in London. And a lot of people will talk about an imbalance in the economy. It's not a concern, so it's massively on my radar since I edit a London newspaper, so we get quite excited when we hear stories about London doing particularly well. But it certainly raises questions about other parts of the country, and we've got the Chancellor's political and personal commitment to the Northern powerhouse, and that has got to be a lot more than just a political project of devolution of decision-making. That has to be combined with a new approach to infrastructure and investments and business generation in the north of this country. Some of the front pages that we have run at City AM in the last few weeks alone, I think, give a flavour of the grounds for optimism about a digital revolution. And a lot of people, I think, talk about a digital revolution that's coming as one which will be largely business to business. The first digital revolution was very much a consumer-facing, consumer-focused experience. A lot of people whose job it is to think quite further into the future identify a second digital revolution as being one which perhaps many of us won't necessarily notice. It won't be aimed at a consumer level, but it will be changing the nature of almost everything. It will be changing the nature of quite established business models in particular. And I don't think that the banks, for example, have more than a few years within them before they have to decide how best to adapt to some incredibly exciting and disruptive innovation in the way people access finance in this country, for example, through alternative finance, peer-to-peer lending, equity lending, you name it. It is shaking things up. A lot of the banks at the moment pay lip service to this idea, and they will say quite publicly that they're all in favour of it and they're going to support this and that they love the plurality and the competition. I think actually they probably struggle to consider how best they're going to deal with which is going to disrupt their traditional industry. But I think it's cause for great excitement, and all attendees at the Battle of Ideas, we probably all enjoy competition and disruption and lowering the barriers to entry, and I think that there's a very exciting story to tell. We know that London, as a financial services hotspot, currently has more people employed in the city in related services than ever before. Some people will view this as cause for concern, and perhaps it's a potential bubble, but the city is a very different place to what it was in 2008. In fact, the sector of financial services and related employment that has the highest premium at the moment on salaries is in compliance and risk, and actually the number of investment bankers is being reduced. So I think the city is a more stable place. London has recently been recrowned as the #1 spot for financial services in the world, and that is not just because it's a very good place for generating money, it's because we have #1 for human capital, #1 for infrastructure. We also have the great advantages of our time zone and language. The city has got an extremely encouraging story to tell at the moment. The next revolution in digital services will be largely unseen by the consumer initially, and then will become more evident as our services are delivered becomes ever more disrupted. I think that we have an optimistic story to tell. I don't buy the scare story about the need to rebalance our economy, which is quite often put forward by people who just don't like the idea that so much of it is generated in the square mile. I don't think it's a question of one or the other. I think it's a question of let's do it all and do it as best we can. So there's much to be excited about. There are some real problems on the horizon, not least the skills shortage, which is just about the biggest threat facing most sectors and industries, and I'm sure we will come onto it.
Excellent. Jeremy?
So the first point I want to talk about is whether we are likely to see a transformational change in the UK over the next 20 years. If we look 20 years back, 1995, you remember the mobiles we were all holding in our hands, the ugly bricks with the aerials sticking out the side. Pretty nasty stuff. We were awaiting eagerly the installation of Windows 95. And of course, Toy Story 1 was being released back then. Now, we've got mobile phones that can do all sorts of things. We can send emails, we can watch films, we can read books, we can even pay for physical goods at stores now with things like Apple Pay. We've got driverless cars, which are being tested in Greenwich, Bristol, Coventry, Milton Keynes. Most of those outside London. We've got thermostats in our house that can learn from us and understand what we like, what temperature we're comfortable at, and then build that into their system, so that we don't even, everything's automated, we don't have to input anything. I'm going to mention one startup outside of London to bring things to life. This startup's based in Plymouth. It's called Open Bionics. And these guys produce a 3D printed prosthetic arm, which can be produced for under £1,000 and in 40 hours. That is quite incredible. And that is the result of a few people outside London, young chaps who had an idea and brought it to life. And they were supported by the ecosystem in the UK, and I'll come on to that in a bit. One technology, as you've all heard, that I'm pretty keen on is virtual reality. I'm a big fan. Has anyone tried on a virtual reality headset, had some sort of experience with one at all? A few, but the majority haven't. This is a virtual reality headset, Samsung's version, the Gear VR. It fits a Note 4, and effectively, you put that over your head. It's not a particularly pleasant sight, so I won't do it now. But the idea is you enter a new world in that virtual reality world, and you can escape from reality, which is effectively what we've been trying to do whenever you go watch a film, you go to the cinema, you go to the amusement park. That's all that we're trying to do effectively, is temporarily escape our reality. It also affects a number of industries. So art, for example, the people who are going to be building the worlds that we're going to play in and live in are going to be the coders, the 3D modelers. Or from a more conventional point of view, we've also got artists from Disney, an animator called Glenn Keane, who did the animation for Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, and so on. He's used a virtual reality headset to actually bring 3D painting to life. So if you look on YouTube, there's a video of him painting Ariel, the Little Mermaid, in 3D space, and it's quite an amazing thing. That's art. Education. What about, instead of being told about Apollo 11 as a kid and reading about it in a textbook and seeing the grainy little pictures in your book, why don't you put one of these on and effectively enter that world? Be in that space shuttle with Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and head to the moon and watch the Earth get smaller and smaller in the window. That is a far more immersive form of education than what we currently have now. E-commerce. There are VR applications there. There's currently a company, a startup, that is being funded by ASOS that allows you to enter a virtual showroom. That creates potentially for retailers unlimited show space, unlimited shelf space. We don't know if it will convert buyers yet, but ideas out there. Social networking. Why has Facebook bought Oculus, the guys that produce the most famous virtual reality headset? Something was revealed recently about them, and it hints at where the social networking space is going to go. It is basically a virtual social networking world where your avatar enters that space and interacts with your friend's avatar. So your heads are there and your hands are there, and you can play ping pong against each other. You can fire lasers at each other, play games, say hi, actually give a proper like gesture in real time. And HoloLens, of course, from the professional point of view. Microsoft is investing a lot of money in this. That could potentially change the way we work. HoloLens is effectively augmented reality. So the idea is your entire world is not overtaken. Instead, there's an overlay on the real world, so objects can appear on walls and on floors and on tabletops. Some of the demos that they've given have involved you bringing up a spreadsheet on your table in front of you while you bring up the latest stock news, Bloomberg, on the wall there, and you can just drag and drop. It's like Minority Report, effectively, if you've ever seen that. And that is a potential world that could happen, I'd say in 5 to 10 years' time properly, but the potential is out there. And all of this is taking globalization to the next level and creating deeper connections amongst all of us. The next point I want to come to is actually job losses and machines. There's a lot of talk about jobs being taken over by machines, and there's a lot of hate towards them for this and what's going to happen to everyone. My personal opinion on it is that it's inevitable. What we have to do is be comfortable with that fact and prepare for that to happen. And I don't believe that there will be a net loss in jobs. In fact, I believe that there will be a net growth that results from these more complicated machines and having to maintain them, having to bring the software up to date with human knowledge and what's going on in our world, having to protect them from cybersecurity threats, and even having to physically manufacture them in the case that they're robots. And finally, my last point, I'll talk about the UK culture and why I think that is helping to push the next industrial revolution forward. If we look at it now, there is a great support system here. In terms of community events, we have free access to mentors, free advice from everything from funding to taxation to marketing. There are organizations like Code First Girls and STEMETS that are encouraging more women to enter the technology field and create a more diverse group of people in that space. The O2 Think Big Hub is funding people as young as 13 years old, giving them the opportunity to bring their ideas to real life. And finally, in terms of professional attitude, companies are dropping UCAS points, they're dropping the necessity for degrees because they don't see a correlation with high-quality candidates. All of this support structure and this open-minded attitude, this pursuit for diversity, will help drive the next industrial revolution, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. Hayaatun.
Thank you. I'm going to focus my opening remarks on engineering and innovation. Now, that might have something to do with the fact that I come from the Royal Academy of Engineering, and the clue is in the name, but actually it's because without engineering and innovation, there certainly won't be any new industrial revolution in this country. So, innovation is the process by which new ideas generate economic and social value. It's instrumental in delivering the economic and the productivity benefits associated with investing in research and science, and that's basically the premise of a knowledge-driven economy. Engineers play a pretty important role in innovation. They take scientific and mathematical knowledge and use it to develop solutions to real-world problems. So sectors with high concentrations of engineers have high levels of innovation activity and innovation-related income, and also high levels of productivity. Now, evidence suggests that these highly skilled engineers are also providing the social networks, the skills, and, to use the technical term, the absorptive capacity to not only do engineering tasks, but also to drive business development more generally across a whole range of sectors, from advanced manufacturing to software, from financial services to the media. And across the economy as a whole, engineering is estimated to account for 20% of UK gross value added, so it's a measure of the economic contribution, and also 50% of UK exports. So it's pretty important we have the engineering skills base that we need to drive the development of new industries. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So almost half of engineering companies say right now that a shortage of skilled people is causing a significant impact on their productivity and their growth. And by 2022, we predict that we're going to have a shortfall of engineers in this country of at least 550,000. So that's pretty high on the list of things we need to tackle. And embedded in that, there's a major diversity problem. But having said that, I agree with my colleagues on the panel, there's a lot of good news. We've got a world-class research base in this country, a world-class university system. We have 4 of the top 10 global universities. We consistently rank in the top 10 countries for innovation performance. And you may have heard about the problem with scaling up startup companies in this country. Nevertheless, out of the 40 so-called unicorns, tech companies with valuations of $1 billion or more, 17 of these are in the UK. So if we tackle the skills gap, well, we have everything sorted. Not quite. We need to see our own innovation performance in the context of a relentless global competition for talent and investment. And the UK's current strong performance in research and innovation is in part really a reflection of our past investments. It takes a really long time, sometimes decades, for new industries born of great ideas, research, to take root and start delivering economic value. And we've had a break on public investment in research in this country over the past 5 years. So in fact, the UK has the lowest levels of government finance investment in research and development as a percentage of GDP of any of the G7 countries. We're going to have a much better chance of building new industries if governments, and I mean successive governments, not this one in particular, are willing to provide long-term commitments to investing in research and innovation, and just as importantly, adopt a more long-term systems view of policy making to support knowledge-driven growth. Having that kind of long-term strategic policy framework, identifying priority technologies and sectors, can make a big difference to our competitiveness by giving business and others the confidence to invest in these areas in the UK. So it's a bit unfortunate that some of the good progress made towards what was known as a modern industrial strategy is starting to look a little bit shaky right now. We've got to remember the UK's got a highly internationalised research and innovation system. 20% of the UK's investment in research comes from overseas, compared to 4% for China, so 4% for Germany, 4% for the US, and 1% for China. Most companies, including UK-owned, UK-based companies, have to make global choices about where to invest in higher value activities like research, like manufacturing. So we need to make sure that we can continue to be an attractive choice, for an attractive destination for talent and investment. And finally, I want to say a really brief word about the idea that this is somehow a competition between manufacturing and services. It really isn't. 40% of manufacturing firms are doing service innovation right now. Rolls-Royce, an archetypal manufacturing company, sells power by the hour. It sells a service. On the other hand, engineering and technology are at the heart of our service industries. So engineering consultancies like Arup, Atkins, Mott MacDonald, these companies are winning major contracts all around the world, and they're based on our engineering prowess. We also have a world-leading position in fintech, the delivery of financial services through technology. And again, that relies heavily on our engineering and technology skills. So I think we're a little bit old-fashioned if we're trying to pit services against manufacturing. So these are just a few thoughts to get us going, and I'm really looking forward to a good discussion.
Thank you very much. Paul?
I'd just like to start on putting some context to what is going to be a set of ramblings, but we'll ultimately come to one or two ideas which hopefully can try and explain what may be holding back a new industrial revolution, if such a thing can occur. My background is I've been involved in digital manufacturing for the last 25 years. That's automatically controlling machines and stuff like that. I don't think it was even called digital manufacturing then. I worked at Airbus. Interestingly, a few of my friends went off to work to some startup in Newbury doing these things called mobile phones, and I thought, oh, how boring is that? That's never going to go anywhere. So I'd just like to use that as an example to indicate the flavour of my abilities for predicting the future of anything. But I'd also like to point out that a lot of my thinking is probably over towards the manufacturing and digital manufacturing side. So only coming forward about 20 odd years, this new industrial revolution thing, where did it sort of come from? In 2010, there's a guy called Chris Anderson who used to write, he's editor for Wired, wrote a small article called Atoms Are the New Bits, which eventually became a book called Makers, the New Industrial Revolution. I don't know who was the first one to use this kind of term, but basically he started saying that, there's obviously not a lot of 3D printing technologies coming around, but he also interestedly played up the idea that beyond the technology, rather like the original Industrial Revolution, there was a social political aspect. I mean, he was saying that production could be democratized and stuff like this. But I suppose for my personal interest, that grabbed my attention because, it basically looked like digital manufacturing was back on the agenda. One thing I would mention, and I'm not trying to play up the services manufacturing thing, but I think it's worth remembering that in the late 90s, early 20s, there was a big concept of the idea that we'd be able to live on thin air. We'd be able to live on our wits, our culture, our knowledge, rather than the old-fashioned making things and stuff like that. And I think after 2010, that idea sort of went away a bit more, which is good. Also, since 2010, there's obviously been this crest of a wave of various technologies. VR's been mentioned, driverless cars, graphene, drones, etc. And there's also bio and nanotechnology, etc. One thing which I think maybe ties in possibly to what Christian was saying, I'm not sure, but there's also the Internet of Things has been a big thing, and in manufacturing it's been branded as Industry 4, and basically it's been banded around as a way to give a boost to or even revolutionise manufacturing. So this is what the consumers aren't going to see. After all, if machines can all talk to each other in a connected network world, then surely there's scope for productivity increases. Alongside that, we've had mobile tech, Uber, Airbnb are obviously the giver one, the ones that are always talked about, and the wider shared economy. And they do indicate that there's a possibility that there is something occurring in the world where technology could be starting to have a significant impact on society, culture, and the economy. A new industrial revolution, maybe, I'm not sure. But to me, I've got a sort of couple of assertions which I believe, taking all that on board, I've been far too quick on my explanation, but there's a couple of things that may be holding it back. Now, firstly, ambitious as many of these technologies, or even for want of a better word, movements may occur in terms of the makers and stuff, and accepting that in some cases they intend to challenge various political and business status quos. Obviously, they only appear and I'm sure people can challenge me on this, appear to fill in niches in existing markets that already exist, that mass production and maybe mass services do not meet. Equally, they may only just squeeze a bit more efficiency, again, from markets and processes that already exist. Taking Uber as an example. And to a certain extent, Toyota have been doing this for the last 20 or 30 years with lean manufacturing. They're really good. They've given an existing industry much better. They've changed the whole industry. Everyone has to do what they're doing. But are they creating a new industry? To me, they're not. Cars are just cars. My main point here is none of these new tech services, etc., actually really physically digs into our existing world. They tend to sit on top of it. Whether it's a business or whether it's actually physically sitting on top of it, they sit on top of society and filling gaps. They don't do what, to me, any industrial revolution worth its salt does, which would be to dig underneath, to completely introduce new forms of infrastructure, fundamentally reshaping the physical landscape, but also the business landscape, and having unpredictable knock-on effects also onto culture and society, not just in business terms. Briefly, if I've got time, secondly, lastly, I'd like to ask the question, can we actually manage a way to a visionary future? So much of what goes on in R&D, infrastructure planning, energy use, raw materials, and even ideas is often constrained about how we think about how we do things now. Ideas are rarely challenged. I mean, basically, there's quite a few new orthodoxies around, but ideas are rarely challenged over things such as the carrying capacity of the planet. We're often told the planet's got a fixed carrying capacity. No one really challenges this. And this, to me, actually blinkers a lot of really revolutionary ideas that could occur. Really revolutionary ideas may use huge amounts of energy to start with, be totally inefficient. So often ideas don't get off the ground, or they're just attenuated because they're actually seen as actually causing more problems rather than solving problems. So, I mean, I'm not going to particularly have a go at the Greens because I think it's more of a general, more wider management view. But if you take sustainability, essentially, to me, it's more a management kind of process, whether it's managing things or whether it's managing people's individual behaviour rather than allowing new things to actually sort of be generated. Also, politics is actually largely populated by managers and often narrow experts, where, to me, visionaries who don't obsess on the small stuff like meeting, say, artificial carbon targets, etc., stuff like this, actually would be people that would actually march forward and actually aim for a larger goal and find that many of the problems that a lot of the naysayers have about what's going on in the world would actually fall on the side, and actually then maybe we would be talking about a new industrial revolution.
Thank you.
Okay.
Jack.
I'm going to be the grumpy old man on the end here. I want us to think a bit more critically about technology and about industrial revolutions. I think we should remember that industrial revolutions are disruptive. They are disruptive because they are not just technological, they are always sociological and cultural as well. It isn't just technology changing the world, it's the world changing around technology as well. And I think it's nice to remember, given that we're still in their bicentennial. So 200 years ago, a group of people took issue with the Industrial Revolution, and their message is often forgotten, and more often it's distorted. These were groups of people who didn't agree with Jeremy that the net job gain of industrial revolutions was fine for them. These were people who were being put out of work by a new technology, and they were, of course, the Luddites. Now, Luddites has now become a pejorative term of abuse for anybody that is seen as somehow anti-technology or anti-progress. I have never met anybody that is anti-technology or anti-progress, but I think we should take the Luddite central point, which is that it's a good idea to ask critical questions of technological proposals, particular technological proposals, in particular circumstances. And we actually need to think critically about technology, even if we don't agree with the Luddites' methods of technological violence. I think technology is solidified politics, and once it gets solidified, I think the stakes are very high. I think we're still dealing with the solidification of past technological choices to do with high carbon energy, for example, to do with high carbon transport, that are proving rather hard to reverse now. So I think we should take seriously the opportunity to make technological choices. We tend to still presume, though, that because technologies are novel, because they are exciting, because they are based in cutting-edge scientific research, that they have some divine right to cross the valley of death into our everyday lives. And I think if you look at examples like, for example, government's policies on graphene, you see that naivety coming through. Just because 2 Nobel Prizes happened to come to Britain because of work that was done on graphene 10 or so years ago, we presume that, therefore, we have a right to benefit economically from patents on graphene. Inevitably, patents of graphene have ended up in the Far East, not in Britain, because we don't have those companies, which wasn't a surprise to anybody that was looking closely, apparently is a surprise to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Similarly, with driverless cars, I think we can look at a technology like that where there's huge excitement. Of course there's huge excitement. That's an amazing idea. But nobody is seriously thinking through what it would take to accommodate driverless cars on a mixed-use road system. We can think about it as an interesting engineering problem, and it is an interesting engineering problem, a fascinating set of experiments. But in terms of how the world will have to accommodate driverless cars, once they become part of our lives, I think we're nowhere near thinking about that. At the moment, like a lot of technologies, it's mostly hype without people thinking through what would actually be required. So, a few words of caution then. I'm just going to end with by criticising two things. The first thing, sorry, Jeremy, to take issue with you. I agree that technology net tends to increase productivity, tends to increase employment levels, but let's not for a second ignore the fact that with all of that there will be winners and there will be losers. To ignore that is to ignore the central question of politics. And we should put that back into the equation. Who benefits, who loses from technological change, and are we happy with that? Are we just happy to say, deal with it? And the second thing is that quite often policy is presented as the problem here. If only policymakers would get out of the way, then the industry, the entrepreneurs, the technologists, the scientists would be able to do their business. I think we need to take seriously the idea that actually policy is the enabler of the vast majority of technological change. Even in bastions of techno-libertarianism like Silicon Valley, the role played by the public sector is absolutely central. I'll stop there.
Any questions or comments?
We've heard a lot about something about skill shortages, and we've also had a comment about the Chancellor of the Exchequer and his vision in science and technology. And I just wonder if a problem in this country is the image that society has of the engineer. My father was Swedish. He qualified as an engineer at the technical high school in Stockholm. He studied for 7 years, and he was very respected in his society, being part of the crème de la crème. In this country, the term engineer is associated with boffin, associated with the man who comes to mend the fridge, and so that's one problem. Do we respect engineers? Would we get better value if society valued engineers? The second point is the position of women in engineering. My elder daughter has a master's degree in mechanical engineering, and in her class there were 7 women out of 120. So are we doing well by excluding about half the population from science and engineering education? And a final point, sitting on the front row, I can see that all of our members of the panel got little white notes about their timing, except for the lady. Perhaps if we did have more ladies around, we might run things better.
First of all, there is no IT system yet devised which is universal, fail-safe, secure, and future-proof. You don't want the IT going down if you're in the middle of a hardtop. Now, I can't do any business under the EU, which is the most strangling business and anti-business institution ever devised. There is no skill shortage. Just don't sack your engineers at 60. I'm still turning up. 100 ideas would produce 10 research projects, maybe 1 money maker. The lab where my friends and I invented fibre optics is now a housing estate, thanks to us, and so is the old British Aerospace. If you put the London Underground map over the north of England, you will see what connectivity means. But basically, can somebody name any engineers in the House of Commons? Do I have to go there every time and say, where's the man in this place?
I just want to consider for a second what actually created the first industrial revolution. And effectively, the first industrial revolution came about through the breakthrough with the invention of the steam engine and the energy bonus that gave from being able to mine coal to far greater depth. Most of the technology that we've talked about today seems to me to be very incremental. We're just talking about doing the same things, building new railways, additional roads, incremental engineering. So my question for the panel really is, where is this kind of breakthrough technology that can filter down in the way that the steam engine revolutionised agriculture, it revolutionised manufacturing, it revolutionised textiles, everything. So where do you see that kind of real breakthrough thing that can filter down across multiple industries and really create a revolution rather than just the technological progress that we see all the time?
So this is backing up Paul's point, really, that there's incremental stuff rather than revolutionary.
There's nothing wrong with incremental gains, and I think the Internet of Things is a very good example of that. The CEO in my office the other day, a manufacturing firm, is incredibly excited about the confluence, not as it is sometimes presented, the conflict between manufacturing and services, but the confluence of it. And somebody who's manufacturing ordinary household items, and it could be a door handle, or it could be a fridge, or it could be an egg timer, but you're suddenly going to be able to, through the Internet of Things, that product is going to be able to deliver a service as well as deliver on its original function. So that is an incremental gain. I do accept that we might be sort of looking around hoping for the next explosive revolution, but this is exactly what was being discussed about that being a wider sort of social, cultural, and indeed scientific endeavour than simply something which is making something we already do a little bit easier or a little bit more efficient or a little bit more interesting. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem.
I'm very interested in the choices that face planners after a huge rise in productivity. It's a key word I've noticed here. Sort of happened. So in the first industrial revolution, planners had a choice whether to give people less working hours, but to keep their pay at the same level, since machines were giving so much productivity, yet they get them at the same levels of working. Now I'm wondering maybe if technology can actually liberate us to actually do more things with our free time, like virtual reality, and have time for more experiences, maybe something towards a 4-hour work week. Something. I wonder if that's something that really we should be thinking of more than anything else. I think that's the whole point of technology, is to give us more free time so we don't do stuff. But it seems like we're working more than ever. That's the main question I was interested in.
You're absolutely right. Ultimately, what technology is doing is just reducing the time we have to spend on mundane tasks. And outsourcing process-driven tasks to the machines is a great idea, in my opinion, because ultimately that's what they're great at doing. We're great at being creative and thinking up new solutions, which is what the machines can't do. So why shouldn't we make them spend all their time crunching all those numbers and dealing with all those process-driven tasks, which gives us more time to do the more creative stuff. The danger is, though, it's not going to end up in a 4-day work week, because ultimately we're going to save a day, and then we're going to fill that day with something else which will speed up technology advancement in the world, in my opinion.
The answer to your question, where's the next breakthrough technology, I think Hayaatun answered it very well with, a very profound point worth considering, which is that she said it takes decades for ideas to turn into something which can actually begin to change the world, that there's a long, long process. And she made the point that it's the lack of investment for a long time, which is what we're seeing around us. I think that's a very good perspective for looking at why it's all incremental at the moment, because what we're living through, and we all like the toys, we love the toys and so on, but what we're living through is the working through of last century's industrial revolution, the digital revolution, not a new thing. The digital revolution was there, it began in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. We're doing incremental bits on that at the moment, but what we don't have, I think Hayaatun was pointing to, we haven't had the substantive investments in basic science and technology going on over the last 30, 40 years in order to create the technologies which we need for the 21st century. And I think in that respect, I'm also perhaps a little bit of coming across as a grumpy old man, but for completely the opposite reasons to Jack. Not because there's too much innovation going on that we're not thinking through the consequences of, but that really there is just too little innovation happening. And I'll end on that point as a sort of indication that, what is innovation for? It's not so we have nicer, smarter toys or fridges that can order the groceries or whatever. We want innovation in order to improve our standards of living. And for all the optimism which was expressed in the first a couple of comments from the platform, the reality is that in living standards terms, we're stagnant at the moment. We are unable to increase our standards of living. Productivity hasn't been shooting away. Productivity has been flat since 2007. GDP per head, the basic measure of living standard, has also been flat for the last 8 years. It's gone absolutely nowhere. So in terms of wages, lots being made of the fact that there's lots and lots of jobs at the moment. True, but look at the quality of those jobs. Those jobs aren't in those new Bristol biotechnology companies. A few of them are, but most of them are in low-value occupations. They're in hospitality industries, they're in retail, they're in personal health care and so on. The average living conditions, the average living standards based on wages has been falling backwards. Now that to me is the only criteria for successful innovation, is if actually it's doing the opposite. And that to me therefore is evidence that there is just not enough innovation going on at the moment to actually create the prosperity that we need today, never mind in the future.
Hayaatun.
Before I come back to that, I'd just like to return to the very nice lady in the front row. She said some nice things about me. But actually, you raised a really important point, which is around cultural perceptions of engineers in this country. And although I think it's really important not to sort of sit here and tell a sob story about how engineers are underappreciated, there is something quite profound in this country. We have by far the lowest levels of women in the engineering workplace in the whole of Europe, so less than 10%. And we've had a very persistent problem over many years. And one of the most shocking statistics that I heard in recent times was that 20% of STEM educators, so educators who teach science, technology, engineering, mathematics, wouldn't recommend engineering as a career to their students. And even worse, 44% of those STEM educators said that they agreed with the statement that engineering wasn't a good career for women because it was associated with men. So there's quite a lot of work to do, and there really is. And then coming back to the wider point, and also pick up a little bit on what Jack was saying, what I think we sometimes forget in this country is that we are a very small island that has some really exciting things happening and lots of good qualities, but we have to consider ourselves as part of this big wide world. Innovation will happen. You know, people are working all around the world on all kinds of interesting things, and the challenge and the question for us is, what relationship do we want to have with engineering and technology? And so if we are not able to be part of the leading edge of at least some of that. You can't be part of all of it. You have to focus. We're not big enough to say we want to do everything. But if we're not part of the leading edge of some of that, then there's a real risk that the change that will inevitably happen in terms of the impact of technology on our work, on what our lives look like, will be something that's determined by other people, and it will be harder and harder for us to make sure that we are at the high value end of that, rather than having to be sort of passive recipients of the impact of technology change. So I think the sorts of issues that I was trying to pick up in my opening remarks are really my view of how we can have a better chance of being at the forefront of that rather than just recipient of it.
Rob, I'll just take this young man here and then you can come in, Jack.
To sort of follow on from the point we had at the back, but sort of jump ahead 5 or 10 years. So he was discussing the living standards issue and the fact that people are working these jobs in things like commerce and health. And I'm currently at school, I'm in my first year of sixth form, and I'm seeing a lot of students that are wanting to go into these sectors. But I'm foreseeing from the advances in technology at the moment, these sectors are going to be rendered pointless because their jobs are going to be taken over by machines. There are going to be computers, especially with the advances in quantum computing, that will be computing what they want to do in their accounting firms. They're going to be doing the jobs for them. So do you foresee an issue, especially with an extreme lack in things like maths teachers and science teachers at the moment, that these people are going to be left behind? There's going to be a major divide with the people that are self-propelled and will push themselves and will go out and learn these things themselves, and students that necessarily will need pushing and therefore will be left behind by this technological advancement because mentally they've not been taught the maths and physics that they need to be able to use their creativity to help them with these things. If their jobs are being taken over in things like factory production lines, what are these people going to do? Are we going to support them with things like taxes and our benefit system? Because the majority of the public disagrees with that at the moment. How do you think these people are going to survive if we do come through an industrial revolution?
Jack.
I mean, the general I wouldn't worry about quantum computers. I think it's a lot of hot air. I think, though, that the general point that you make is a good one, and we should remember that technologies, if they are developed thoughtlessly, tend to exacerbate inequality, which is counter to the rhetoric of much innovation, which is that it's emancipatory, that it's empowering, that it will help the people that are worst off. The history of technology tells you that the people that will benefit most from the technologies are already the powerful and the rich. Now, that isn't to say that that's inevitable. We can come up with pro-equality technology policies. But it gets back to the point that was being made at the back, and I was accused of that I thought there was too much innovation in the world. And I think the fact that I can be accused of that suggests everything that is wrong with this debate, which is that we are seen as being pro or anti-innovation. I look at areas where there isn't nearly enough innovation, and that's things like targeting neglected diseases. It's delivering green energy, right? I see a massive vacuum of innovation there. It just so happens that that is seen as a somehow heretical thing to be able to say, at the moment we have made certain innovation choices and ignored others. And I think part of the reason we do that is because we massively privilege the role that technology has played in history and downplay the more complicated things. We talk about breakthroughs leading to industrial revolutions, and we forget about all the other things. You know, the empowerment of women, the creation of new company structures, the invention of money, the liberalisation of trade, that actually allowed the Industrial Revolution to make a difference to the world. So I think we need to realign and put technology in its place a little bit more.
Can I follow up on that?
Not yet.
It's a response to the skills shortage of engineers in the UK. Currently I'm doing my master's degree in civil engineering. Most of my peers have A-levels in maths and all the sciences, where as I did maths along with art and music. Do you think that universities should be more accepting of students with wider kind of educational backgrounds in different subjects, and maybe put higher value on the skills that come with arts and humanities, especially when engineering to me is all about creativity and problem solving?
Immediately on that, sort of related a bit to what Jack was saying about the social implications. I work alongside Hayaatun at the Royal Academy of Engineering, and we constantly see increasingly big systems and systems of systems coming together, and what are needed are multidisciplinary teams of people with diverse skills. So not just the STEM, obviously the STEM, but the social skills and the artistic skills and the design skills, and the understanding of the sector you're working in. And it's that's needed. And that, hopefully, if you bring in social scientists and other people like that, you might be able to understand how the technology can change and develop. That, hopefully, would bring through the more than incremental change in sectors that we really need it. So if I pick something like health and social care, technology has always promised a great deal, but so far is maybe not delivering. And one of the reasons I suspect for that is that there's the sort of geeks that try to sort of say this is a solution, but it's not filtering through into the clinicians and the nurses and the patients as well. So you have to, the whole system and all the people in that system have to be able to understand it and play a role before it can be really transformative. So that broadness, that multidisciplinary systems view is what's really important, and that's where I think the real step changes will start to come through.
Paul?
The guy mentioned about the first industrial revolution, blah, blah, blah. To me, actually, the technological thing that sparked it off was James Watt's external condenser, which meant steam engines couldn't just be stuck, they could be moved around, ended up being on steam trains, blah, blah, blah. And this actually ties in a kind of, I don't know if anyone remembers James Burke's Connections in the 1970s. Bit rubbish, but anyway, I still think there are connections where you can connect those large-scale technological improvements to things like the empowerment of women. You know, the generation of a large printing industry, the fact that, you know, novels were produced, people learnt to read. They might have read novels, but they also increased their ability to read and then take on political ideas and stuff like that, and they were communicated. So I don't think it's an either-or. You know, they are connected together in a quite important
Except
way.
that we tend to say it's technology that's causing them, rather than the other way
This isn't a conversation, you can do that.
Well,
it's not a conversation.
Okay, maybe we do know, but I still see it as you still can have one with the other. And also, to finish my point, I guess, yes, people talk about James Watt and the steam engine, but they forget Matthew Bolton, who was his business partner, who, you know, come up with new ways of running business and stuff, which was just as important. And you mentioned the cultural and legal thing. I think that is one thing that everyone needs to remember when we're talking about this. But one thing, and this connects a bit to your Luddites type thing, what people don't really seem to be talking about, and what I was kind of talking about, is all of these new technologies and even new business ideas and stuff are fitting on top of what we're doing now. And we seem to be scared, we don't have any political leadership or to actually do something. In the past, we've had big recessions, you know, serious crises and stuff like that, which have caused problems. You know, people have lost jobs, etc. But what is often resulted from that is that we have had increases in productivity and stuff. Things have kind of got better. And obviously that has happened in this kind of fatalistic way. You know, it's happened, so no one's really got to take the blame for it, kind of thing. So, but the issue we've got now is we almost seem to be too scared. We're not getting those kind of businesses industries being destroyed. They're more or less just limping along, you know. They're zombie companies, I think is a term that's being used. So we're in a position now, given we know about the Luddites, is there a way that we can consciously restructure the economy? You know, people might be thrown out of jobs, whatever. But yeah, but my point is, to me, the importance of this is actually restructuring the economy, getting rid of dead industries so we can produce new industries in a way that we consider socially acceptable nowadays.
I disagree with the idea that we're living through a new industrial revolution. I think that in the past 100 years, the industrial revolution has been ongoing, and it's still ongoing. But my question was, if the government is making so many cuts to so many different jobs, is it really their responsibility to fund these new industries that we don't know are going to work? And if not, how do we go about funding industries while not endangering the economy?
Hayaatun mentioned it in her introduction, but there was talk during the coalition of an industrial policy. That language seems to have been dropped since the new government came in. But what do we think the state is doing too much, not enough, or just about right? I mean, what is the role of the state in generating and encouraging new industries? I think that would be a useful topic, although we've got quite a lot on the table already. So,
a very similar question to that, but also specifically, should the state have a bigger role in finance? So a lot of people look to Germany, look at their regional banks, which are public banks with a remit to invest at a kind of more regional level, or other people have suggested something like strategic quantitative easing. So that's a bigger role for finance in directly funding investment, but specifically also the question is, should the state have a bigger role in these new banking structures potentially?
I've been reading Peter Diamond's and Stephen Kotler and Salim Ismail. Their basic arguments are, firstly, there's a digital revolution, and once things get digitized, they go exponential. And another fundamental argument that they give is that human beings think linear and that we don't get exponential. And so we don't see the world as it might be. We just can't visualize it. It's like we couldn't visualize the impact of smartphones. So what does the panel think of that? Because I think, personally, that we just can't see the future. And it's about to happen big style, in that money's going to change, society's going to change, and it's all because of the digital revolution, which is about to go really big exponential.
Christian.
Okay, on a couple of points. The first, go back to the point that chap made down here. You're in the sixth form and you're thinking, what jobs are they going to be? I mean, one way to look at that is to think this is very exciting. You're educating yourself for jobs which probably have not yet been created. And the other way to look at it is that you should just become a plumber, because I think that's going to be one of the most secure forms of employment. This business, again, we return to on incremental gains and where this revolution is going to be obvious to us here in Britain. I mean, we should count ourselves fortunate that the revolution, I mean, there is no crying need for a revolution to be that obvious to us. We're talking about slightly faster internet, slightly more efficient homes, slightly better cars, slightly more affordable technology. You don't have to go far in the world to see where this revolution is occurring and where it makes an enormous change. So if you take, for example, regions in sub-Saharan Africa where the median age is 18, and because of a telephone, a mobile phone that we would consider embarrassing to be seen with, you have millions upon millions of people who have for the first time the ability not only to save small amounts of money, but to send money between each other via text message. They are leapfrogging technological stages of innovation in parts of the world where they really are talking about a revolution that really is changing the nature of their lives and societies in the way that perhaps here enjoying the benefits of incremental gains and thinking how we can squeeze more productivity or squeeze more efficiency or squeeze more leisure time out of our environment makes us, I think, pause to reflect on how fortunate we are. And on the point about regional banking and whether the government could get more interventionist in supporting these industries, I mean, generally speaking, I think that's a terrible idea. The government does not have a great track record of picking winners and determining which businesses and which sectors and which parts of the country should be generated. Gordon Brown tried to do it with his regional investment bank. It was a disaster. We don't have the German model. What we do have is an extraordinarily exciting opportunity to ride the wave of the democratization of capitalism, which means that it has never been easier to start a business. It has never been easier to find one of 40 different types of alternative finance to get your idea off the ground. Government doesn't have much to do with that beyond light touch regulation, and I think we should keep it that way.
You all seem to think that innovation is a really good thing, but aren't you worried about all the jobs that might disappear? For example, there's this robot called Baxter, which has this learning software, and it costs like 5p a minute for the electricity to run it. So it could not only steal those 2 million manufacturing jobs, but also like the jobs of a Starbucks barista. You'd probably even be able to spell your name right. And also driverless cars, they're not meant to be perfect, they're just meant to be better than us. And if they do become better than us, then all these truck drivers will lose all their jobs because there's something that can do it better. And I'm also worried that like there's not enough caution. Nanotechnology, there's these silver nanoparticles which they put in plasters, which can kill bacteria. But the worry is that they can escape into like sewage systems, and if you swallow those, they'll kill all the extremely important bacteria on your stomach lining. And so in nanotech, there's like a lot of ideas, but there's not a lot of caution.
The panel is desperately seeking to dodge the question which is coming from the floor, which is whether the Industrial Revolution has anything to do with productivity, and whether innovation is simply a way of a code word which effectively is there to avoid a discussion of what technology and engineering has to do when it comes to raising productivity, and how that affects what the gentleman at the back was talking about, which was rising living standards. I think Christian's point, kind of rather glib and cynical assertion that all we're doing is just incrementally adding a little bit of extra niceness to what is already fairly established, kind of betrays the lack of ambition, lack of interest in really talking about revolutionizing an economy through technology. Because it's not that we're happy enough, right? I mean, sub-Saharan Africa might be fine. They might like having a new mobile phone, and that might be for them an extraordinary leap, and it is. But that doesn't mean that in the industrialized, wealthy world, we should be settling for what we have. I mean, we talk about, it's very easy to be cynical about lots of aspects of these innovations that we see.
I'm not cynical.
No, hang on. It's very cynical. It's very easy to be cynical about the Internet of Things, because in the end, I come home, I have a slightly better thermostat to heat a house which is over 100 years old in a country where we're not building any houses. It's very easy to be cynical about a government whose one great attempt to reform planning legislation in the last Parliament barely managed to scrape through an amendment that allows you to slightly extend your conservatory, right? I mean, it's easy to be cynical when you listen to people celebrating British engineering and manufacturing and always talk about Rolls-Royce and Aston Martin, right? The real issue is not that they're great companies or they're great technology. It's why is it that Aston Martin isn't building really good carbon fiber body cars for everybody, right? Rather than the elite who can afford them. So there are some issues here about, well, what is engineering supposed to do, or what is it for when it comes to developing people's access to a better life through technology and through the gains that it produces in terms of economic productivity?
So is it all about productivity, Hayaatun?
50% of productivity growth in the UK between 2000 and 2008 is attributed to innovation. You can look at this from an economic perspective, but you can look at this to actually in practical terms. If a company needs to become more productive, what are the options? What are the alternatives open to them? And really, I don't see how you can do this stuff without innovation. What is the alternative? So I think, sometimes we do get lost in sort of the narrative, but actually in very practical terms, innovation is incredibly important, both for developing new tools to tackle major social challenges at the level of an individual company, helping them to be competitive, and at the level of an economy as a whole. I'm not intentionally trying to sort of dodge anything around that. I think this issue of revolution it's difficult, because a revolution is a very subjective concept. How do you know when you're in a revolution? And sort of building on comments that Christian said, I think we're in a country that has a lot of infrastructure, so it's not surprising that change seems like it's incremental and building on the infrastructure we have. And that's why in regions where there is much less infrastructure, like sub-Saharan Africa, there genuinely is a revolution associated with technology. And to respond to something that Jack has said, it's not a revolution that only benefits the people already at the top of the pyramid. It benefits people at the bottom of the pyramid too. Technology is enabling citizens to hold their governments to account. It's much easier to see whether elections are being rigged or not. It has really practical impacts on people's daily lives. It enables them to do business in a way that they couldn't before. It makes life fairer for them. People can find out the market price of a good they're selling rather than having to go through an intermediary who will just, tell them information that suits that intermediary rather than the producer. So I think there already is a real revolution happening in many parts of the world, because we have a very, quite sophisticated set of infrastructures and industries in this country. It's harder to see that the change at a revolutionary level, and perhaps the risk is also that we don't have the drivers of innovation as strongly as some of those other countries, which means that we may not be pushing forward the boundaries in the same way. But there's also a flow of innovation from the developing world to developed countries. So things like very simple tablets were partly developed because of the need to have rugged, simple computers for use in developing country contexts. And that is in turn coming back and benefiting our markets.
Nico MacDonald of Big Potatoes. I want to take issue a bit with Paul, who is a bit glib about the profundity of innovation or how it happens. He gave the example of Uber. Now, I think very few revolutions that are technology driven, and I very much sympathise with Jack's model of this being a socio-technical thing, happen by flipping a switch. I've worked in electronic publishing for 25 years. We started digitising things by making magazines that were still printed. Once copy was digitised, we could make products that became the web. And I think things like Uber may be a portend for a form of autonomous vehicles in different forms. Whether that's a desirable future or not is another question. But these things do tend to happen incrementally by addressing a problem in an existing industry that then realises new potential, which we can then understand and implement. And briefly on government and what it's doing, the Innovate UK tends, I'm afraid, to fund the established industries, the Rolls-Royces, the Aston Martins we've talked about, and is so hidebound by how it justifies the funding decisions it makes for smaller companies that it fails to actually use its own creative intelligence.
Unlike other times in history, we have luxury to make moral judgments these days. So innovators can make a moral judgment. Are we comfortable of having a technological advantage to destroy all countries and societies? Are we allowed to ask this question ourselves? Who are we innovating for? Transfer technology is not only mini tablets, it's also no-fly zones. So, is it a legitimate question?
It's all legitimate.
There's been talk about the car industry and the productivity gains, etc., that's got in it. I mean, and the technological innovations don't necessarily. What about an innovation of how do we kill the car industry? I mean, basically, the cars are not significantly changed. They're limited at 70 miles an hour. There are concerns over the emissions and stuff like that. So to me, a better way, I've got no immediate answers, a better way to solve those problems is to come up with something better than cars. So cars just drift away.
What about a car that pretends that it doesn't have the problem you thought it had by faking tests?
Okay, well that's one thing. That's one thing. But my point more is, and it ties into what this guy said here. We're living in Victorian houses mainly. They either are physically Victorian or they're built like the Victorians. I don't want to do a Concorde to the advanced passenger train that didn't quite work. But there's lots of stuff that the automotive industry use that could be used in mass house production. The problem we've got in the UK, and I think that could work in China, no problem, and the British people working in the British car industry could produce homes, whatever, really good ones for places around the problem in Britain is we've got the green belt issue, where even if you could produce good, cheap houses, they'll still be expensive because the land's so expensive. So there's social things like that that we need to deal with in the UK as far as our attitude to the future.
Or as somebody said, where's my jetpack? That's the question. Where's my jetpack?
We've talked a lot about needing to improve productivity as using innovation for that. But I think the atmosphere for creating business at a micro level is getting better and things are improving there. I think we've got a lot to do at the middle level of government policy, and certainly having seen in China where I went to a second-tier city, they had 13 incubator companies there and 9 were government-sponsored and government-run. So they're able to direct a lot more and a lot better good industries that they see growing and the need to grow on. But I think there's a third level, which is sort of major dislocation events, which we haven't talked about. So, for instance, in 2050, I think they say 4 billion people will live in countries with water scarcity. We think that quite a few Syrians coming across the border
is quite a big thing now and impacting Europe, but that's nothing compared to some of the things that are on the horizon. So I wonder what the panel think about sort of steering innovation towards some of those major problems that are on the horizon.
I'm going to give each of the panel now a minute to address what they think is the most important point, not every point. So in reverse order, Jack.
I like where we've ended up, in effect. There are big problems in the world. How do we get innovation better aligned with addressing those? And that seems to me the central question. It's not about how do we generate the next industrial revolution. It's about what is engineering, what is innovation for? And that, from that question, should follow everything else, I think. Whether it's thinking about why we don't have jetpacks, because it turns out we don't want them and they're a rubbish idea anyway. Why are we innovating in finance? Is just more finance a good enough answer? I don't believe it is. From that, how do we assess the risks and benefits of technology? You know, driverless cars, yes, we can say they're quantitatively safer, but they're also qualitatively different in how they interact with our lives. That's the interesting question, it seems to me, in terms of their ability to shape the future. The nanotechnology and silver nanoparticles one, I think, is a lovely example. We have been rather lackadaisical when it gets to nanotechnology, but also we should remember that nanotechnology was going to be the third industrial revolution, right? Let's stop taking these innovation claims at face value. We had no idea what it would take for nanotechnology to become the third industrial revolution. It turns out it's just chemistry, and we're fine with that. The final point I would just make was one about interdisciplinarity, because it came up. I think this is going to be broadly the answer. I think for specialist education and specialist companies are going to find it harder and harder. I think those people able to adapt and engage are going to be broad-based. They're going to be broadly educated. We at UCL have a brilliant new degree, which is a Bachelor of Arts and Sciences, and I think we're going to see more in that mode. I'll end there.
Thank you, Paul.
I agree with you, Jack, on a lot of things. All of these things about, you know, these new waves of technologies, blah, blah, blah. It's basically people ignoring problems and just want to get on with something more exciting. I think the fundamental point of this discussion is more about how do you address the productivity thing. And as I say, my idea is we should be thinking on the industry level. How do we replace industries? How do we come up with new industries? I think that is the fundamental thing. And we need to sometimes pretend that when I mean, again, I come back to the car industry. One of the car industry is just totally full of overcapacity. It may look good in some areas, but ultimately got quite poor productivity. I think on the education thing, I mean, I did aeronautical engineering. I wouldn't call myself an engineer anymore. I'm software. But if I was wanted to get into that kind of subject, I'll be picking maths, physics and chemistry, but I definitely wouldn't be doing, and this might be a bit controversial, I wouldn't be doing something like design tech or something like that. I'd pick philosophy or history or something that broadens the mind, not sort of narrows it down that kind of way. And this connects a bit with about engineers. I mean, engineers, they're not homogeneous. You've got engineers that have different opinions. You've got people that are pro-sustainable things, anti-sustainable things. They should actually start to learn to put themselves in public, arguing amongst themselves. Yep. Okay. That's the only way they're going to be politicians, which everyone complains about. Hayaatun.
Thank you. Well, despite the best efforts of some people in the room here today, I remain optimistic. We support lots of early stage researchers and entrepreneurs through our activities at the Royal Academy of Engineering, and I see amazing stuff, amazing people doing amazing stuff on a day-to-day basis. All these buzzwords around virtual reality and 3D printing, I see how they're taking advantage of those technologies and using them to do really interesting things that are going to make a difference. I think the government has an incredibly important role to play. It has to create a positive climate for innovation to happen, for an industrial revolution, if you want to call it that, to happen. So that means looking after things like the skills base, making sure that we produce the quantity, but also the quality and the right type of skills that we need to participate in any future revolutions. They need to provide a consistent and internally kind of coherent policy framework. So there's not one part of government policy saying we don't want any people from overseas to come and help us grow our industries in the UK, at the same time as recognising that we have a skills gap. And they also need to, the government policy also needs to address market inefficiencies. So I think there's some really important points made here about major social challenges, global grand challenges that are going to affect all our lives, and that we need to have better responses to than we currently do. So there's a role for government there in encouraging innovation in those areas. And very lastly, I do think that part of the problem is we're using the concept of an industrial revolution. Actually, what really matters is drawing on research and innovation to make sure that we are able to continue to make our own quality of life better, to compete in the global economy, to be a healthy, wealthy nation. So that's my view.
Thank you very much. And Jeremy?
I'm equally positive, and I'd like to tackle your point actually about what job should I go for, what should I study at university. Same questions I asked myself. I did mathematics because I didn't know what to do, and it sounded like a good degree. Since then, I've been involved in helping disabled students at university with their studies, stockroom assistant at John Lewis. I've been involved in auditing companies. I've been on the business recovery side of companies, and now involved in consultancy in emerging digital technologies. I think we're very lucky in the UK ecosystem that we can study effectively what we want to within some reason and still be respected no matter what that is, and still have access to a massive wide range of graduate jobs. It's not the same in other parts of the world. I think that really differentiates us. Second point on the diversity bit that you mentioned, we absolutely do need more arts grads in engineering. Equally, we need, it's all about the bigger picture of the combination. We need maths grads, we need arts grads, history majors, biology majors. That mix of people with different educational backgrounds, different life experiences, that is what makes a complete picture and will help us progress in the future. Final point on the next big thing. That is a big topic that we've all been talking about. And I think it's I don't think it's right to try and attribute the revolution to a single technology. There are a number of technologies that we discussed: drones, driverless cars, 3D printing, the Internet of Things, quantum computing, etc., etc. And it may not be that one of them is the winner. It may be, in fact, that collectively they do produce a revolution that we'll see in 15 to 20 years' time.
Thank you. Christian?
I mean, it occurs to me, first of all, that I promised you a discussion about sex robots, and we haven't had it. So I think we're going to have to come back next year for that particular debate. Look, 40% of GDP in this country is dependent on companies that did not exist 15 years ago. It did not exist 15 years ago, so we cannot possibly imagine what's going to exist in 5 or 10 years' time. So I wouldn't worry too much about what you're studying and where your job's going to come from, because there will be jobs. Let's just focus very quickly on finance, because I think it's a good example. And Jack, you raised the question, innovation in finance, is it just to generate more finance, and who benefits? Well, I'll tell you who benefits through the innovation in finance. It is everybody. And to the point of the young man about where we're going to have a greater distribution of opportunity and wealth across the country, we absolutely will, and we're seeing it. Because gone are the days where the bank lending rate would be determined by 4 corrupt traders in a chat room, and it's now being crowdsourced to a point of critical mass where a new lending rate is being determined in real time every minute. That extraordinary explosion of democratic access to finance and to the backing of people's different companies, different ideas, all across the country, is one of the most exciting elements of the revolution in financial technology. And I think that is what is going to power a huge amount of the innovation that we're going to see. It is cause for optimism. It is essentially smashing an old corporatist cartel of a system of finance, of bank finance and bank lending, and it means that anybody can start a business, can take forward an idea, and it's the reason why 600,000 businesses were started in this country last year, and I'm sure there'll be 800,000 more over the next 12 months.
A big hand for all our speakers.